Everett Planning Commission. Could we please have a roll call?
Acting Chair Lavera,
Present.
Commissioner Zielinski,
Here.
Commissioner Ballard,
Here.
Commissioner Chatters,
Here.
Commissioner Atkins.
Here.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if we have anybody online or,
No one online.
should I go ahead and read the instructions if we don't have anybody?
Yeah, I think the instructions are only for folks participating in the meeting immediately, so, you know what, in case somebody is watching and intends to sign on soon, maybe
I
we
can go
better
ahead and do it, I
do
guess, okay.
Yeah, it's good practice.
Okay, to those of you in the room, welcome back. To those of you joining us remotely, please mute your microphone, or if you are calling in, mute your phone by pressing *6. After each of our action or discussion items, I will ask for any public comments. If you are participating remotely and would like to provide public comments, unmute your microphone, or if you are calling in, unmute your phone by pressing *6. After you provide comment, please mute your microphone or phone. Okay, at this time, has everyone had a chance to review the minutes? Any comments, corrections? Demi?
Thank you. On page 3, the fourth paragraph down, where it says, Commissioner Chatters asked for clarification on short-term rental parking. That would actually be more correct to state and specifically what the regulation is for a dwelling that is both owner-occupied and short-term rental. And then the response after that says Mr. Stevens Wajda responded that that the parking regulation should be clear. That wasn't my recollection. My recollection was that he responded that his intention was that the parking regulations were clear.
I'll make the change.
Okay, any other corrections? Do we have a motion?
I'd like to make a motion that we approve the minutes as amended.
Thank you.
I'd like to second.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Atkins,
Aye.
Commissioner Chatters,
Yes.
Commissioner Ballard,
Yes.
Commissioner Zielinski,
Abstain.
Acting Chair Lavera.
Yes.
Thank you.
Do any of the members have a report? Okay, thank you. Then I guess it's time for staff comments.
Thank you, Vice Chair Lavra. Good evening, everyone. I'm York Stevens Wajda, Planning Director for the city. Today's meeting, we've got 2 items that we've been working on for quite a while, so hoping to bring these 2 topics, homeless shelters and housing, and removing the maximum, the limit on the maximum number of residents in a dwelling unit. Hoping that we can get to a recommendation from the commission today so that we can send those 2 proposals on to the city council and then move on or maybe move back, as it were, to the accessory dwelling units work that we had begun with a briefing a few months ago. And then, of course, the comprehensive plan periodic update. We've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes, but have been stretched to kind of really do all 3 of those things at the same time, and we wanted to really focus on these 2 proposals and get those off of the Planning Commission's agenda, and then we'll turn back to those other 2 items at the next meeting. I give a short update on Housing Action Plan implementation. We started work on the Housing Development Incentives Study, and this is a grant-funded project to look at our incentives, including tax exemptions, fee waivers, density bonuses, height bonuses, and the like, and make sure that they are all dialed into the right level of incentive to encourage the public benefit and encourage the development while getting as much public benefit out of the development without stopping the development. As I mentioned, the accessory dwelling units, we're looking forward to bringing that conversation back to the Planning Commission perhaps next month. We ended the discussion a couple months ago with a list of proposed amendments to it, and we've been doing some thinking and some work behind the scenes on that one as well. So we're looking forward to bringing a discussion back and potentially some actual proposed code language for those accessory dwelling units. We've gotten a lot of feedback from the public, homeowners who are interested in building accessory dwelling units, developers and architects who are interested in building accessory dwelling units, and those that are watching the housing affordability crisis right now that are also interested in accessory dwelling units. So there's a lot of energy around that, and we're looking, and it's an action in the housing action plan. So we're looking forward to getting back to that. We also hired a special projects coordinator for housing to beef up our staff capacity a little bit around this, and that staff member started work about a month ago and is going to be a point person for housing policy and really keeping a close eye on it in a number of different ways. Couple updates on the comprehensive plan update. We're excited to receive notification just yesterday that we were awarded the middle housing grant from the Department of Commerce, $100,000 to fund actions towards permitting additional housing choices in single-family neighborhoods within the city. That's another action out of the housing action plan, and so this support from the state is going to help give us some of the resources to do some of that work. We are also working on a grant that is a formula grant, so I think we're more or less guaranteed to get it, that will support our work on the periodic update to the comprehensive plan. We're going to combine a little bit those two grants, and we're going to keep the two scopes apart, but I think they're all part of the same overall work plan because the comprehensive plan update is going to address middle housing, and the middle housing grant, we have 4 particular deliverables that we're looking to accomplish with that grant. The first is a gap analysis report that is going to look at what comprehensive plan policies, actions, goals, and also which development regulations might frustrate or prohibit the addition of middle housing. We will create and document some middle housing related components of an outreach and engagement report for inclusion in the full periodic update engagement report. So that's when I said that we're combining these a little bit. We expect the middle housing grant scope of work to deliver some interim deliverables that will then feed into the comprehensive plan periodic update. So it didn't seem like it would make sense to get all the way to an ordinance and actual changes to the comprehensive plan and development regulations that would be necessary for the middle housing deliverables just a year before we would be doing the periodic update work. But we can use those resources to really advance that portion of the periodic update, and then we will give those deliverables back to Commerce to show success with the grant resources, and then continue on with the periodic update and hopefully bring it all together in one adoption package recommended by the Commission and adopted by the City Council in 2024. So I mentioned the gap analysis, the outreach and engagement report. There's also a racial equity and displacement analysis that is required of the middle housing work program. It's also required of the comprehensive plan periodic update. So that's another one where we will be using the grant resources to really flesh out the equity and displacement aspects of allowing additional housing choices in single family zones with the middle housing scope of work. And then we will incorporate that into a full report on those topics associated with the periodic update. And then the more general middle housing related components of staff reports, comprehensive plan amendments, ordinance sections, environmental checklist, and environmental impact analysis. So all of this is like a piece of the comprehensive plan update, a very important piece, and it's associated a lot with one of the, if you remember back to the alternatives that we addressed during the scoping process. There was a concentrated alternative and a dispersed growth alternative and a no action alternative. we see the middle housing work fitting in nicely with the dispersed housing or the dispersed growth alternative. Overall, with those grant resources, the expenditure plan includes, and I think this is, we were excited to come up with this idea. I think the last month's Planning Commission meeting and our discussion around equity really highlighted some of the work that we needed to do around that topic, and especially around engagement. And so luckily we had some additional resources with the periodic update grant and the middle housing grant to be able to advertise, and it's actually out on the street now, for a planning and community engagement coordinator position. So this would be a term limited position funded by the grant that would do an engagement plan and really beef up our capacity to get out into the community, to inform the community about the implications of the periodic update and the implications of the middle housing work, and really generate some interest and get some comments back from the community out there. So we'll be looking to make that hire here pretty soon, and their first bit of work is going to be to prepare an engagement plan. And then the next piece of work will be to implement that plan. So we will check in with the Planning Commission regularly on this, and we'll probably have some specific briefings on that. So it was a good feeling, I think, to recognize where we needed a little bit more support and to have the means to do so. So we're really excited about that. We're also looking at some planning analysis and visualization software to help with analysis and visualization, so you'll be able to see some of the fruits of that. We're looking at some vendors, and we're going to get some proposals in the next couple of weeks for that. And then a little bit of money potentially for supplies for outreach, if there's room rentals, if there's facility rentals or other printing flyers, maybe advertising, either electronically or in print, and those sorts of things. So that is generally the expenditure plan for the grant resources, and it's going to support both of those work efforts, the middle housing and the overall comprehensive plan periodic update. Those are the staff comments for now. As always, I'd be happy to take any questions on anything I mentioned or anything else.
Would you like to share who was hired as the new housing special coordinator?
The housing special coordinator is Jennifer Gregerson is her name. And we do not have a name yet for the planning and community engagement coordinator yet. Any other questions? Thank you.
Do we have anyone online now? Okay, so I guess there will be no public comment at this point. So we could move on to the first action item, which is homeless shelters and housing. I guess we're opening the hearing.
Do you have to make a motion to, or vote to open
How do
the
we do
hearing?
this with procedures? I think we'll go through the staff briefing first, and then we can have some questions from the commission, and then we open the public hearing formally, and then close it
Okay,
if and when we're
okay.
done hearing from the public,
Okay.
and then move into deliberations and recommendation.
Okay. Good evening, commissioners. It's great to be here with you tonight. We've been talking about this subject for a while, but this is the first of two public hearings this evening on revising regulations for homeless shelters and housing. Next slide. So tonight's public hearing, I will do a little bit of a recap and of where we've been, why we're doing it, and provide you with some updates that we've made since we were here in June. Hear any public testimony that might be given tonight, help answer any questions, and it's your time for discussion, and hopefully you will feel like you can make a planning commission recommendation tonight onto the city council. Next slide. So as you might recall, this is in response to House Bill 1220. That bill had a lot of components to it, primarily related to housing. And this is one of them that we're addressing tonight. It's already effective under state law, so we're just catching up to what we need to be catching up to. We've talked with you, briefings on April 19th, on May 17th, and then again on June 21st, as we've come to you with different iterations and updates. So the
Next
state.
slide.
So sorry.
Next slide, Pipa.
There we go.
For those watching, we had some technical difficulties and we're gonna have a remote slide turner, so you'll hear the next slide at times. And then we've got a separate set here, so we'll try to keep the two synchronized. Thank you, Pipa.
So this response has to do with the provision the legislature made in that a city shall not prohibit transitional housing or permanent supportive housing in any zones in which residential dwellings or hotels are allowed. And then further, that a city shall not prohibit indoor emergency shelters and indoor emergency housing in any zone in which hotels are allowed. Next slide. So we've gone through our entire development regulations, and so development is included in both Title 15, which has to do with our processes and procedures, and then Title 19, which is our Unified Development Code. So after going through and analyzing what is required, there are several amendments that are needed to come into compliance with 1220. So the first one is under our current regulation, we have a use called group housing temporary shelter. And really that was used to cover any type of homeless shelter. And so under the provisions of state law, we had to break that apart to make sure that we were covering everything that we were required to. So in that case, we're separating that use into 3 different uses called emergency housing, as called out by state law. That's really a short-term housing solution that may or may not require a lease, but it's there to help individuals who are currently or imminent risk of being homeless. Then the indoor emergency shelter, which is things like the Gospel Mission, which provides that temporary shelter for individuals who may be currently experiencing homelessness, doesn't require a lease, and may include day centers. So the emergency housing, we're proposing to adopt the state's definition under the RCW. And for the indoor emergency shelter, that is our definition, and we took what we had and made some adjustments to it. And then for emergency outdoor shelter, again, we made some adjustments to our definition, but that's really those temporary outdoor, could be tents. You're probably familiar with the pallet shelters, and could be even tiny homes. But they are outdoor, and they are for individuals who may be currently experiencing homelessness. Next slide. Okay, sorry. So there's a couple more definitions that we feel are appropriate to add, and that has to do with the temporary extreme weather shelters. Those are very cyclical, seasonal. They need to pop up when they need to pop up, so it's a way to for the city to have some surge capacity. It's used for example, cooling centers, and maybe if we're having some heavy smoke for those individuals that are oversensitive or need to be in a different environment. And then of course our cold, freezing winter nights. So these types of shelters often get used by a lot of members of the community, maybe not just those that are experiencing homelessness, but who need that extra support in an extreme weather condition. Excuse me. Transitional housing was another definition that we did not have in our code, and it's directly spelled out in House Bill 1220, and we're proposing to use the RCW definition. But it's a little bit of a longer housing solution. It could be up to 2 years to get somebody stable, and really the goal is to get them to a more permanent solution within those 2 years. Next slide, please. And then taking another look at, in these housing solutions that we're talking about, a large component of them is the social services that are provided to the residents. And the way our definitions or uses worked in our table, it was a little bit confusing. We had a definition for community services and we had a definition for social service facilities. And it made sense to combine those two. So we didn't need both of them, and make it much more clear where they can be and where they can't be. They're generally operated by public agencies or nonprofits or other charitable organizations. What they are not, social services, are the schools, hospitals, daycares, food banks. They're not included. We took the opportunity as well to eliminate one of the definitions, because supportive housing, which we do have in our definitions, and permanent supportive housing, which we do have in our definitions, are virtually the same thing. And so we are going to propose that we use the permanent supportive housing definition. It has a state definition that we would use, and we did include a reference to supportive housing since we have permitted the a facility under that term. Just included a reference to it in the permanent supportive housing so that doesn't get lost. So the only thing left in the code at this point was a parking minimum. And so we just changed more of a technical correction to change it to mean permanent supportive housing. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're on to the use tables. This is in 1905. And as you can see there, we've eliminated the group housing temporary shelter. We previously had permitted those as 12 or fewer and then more than 12. They weren't allowed in our single family zones except by a religious organization per state law. A religious organization has the right to hold shelter people. So we've eliminated that. We've added our new uses. And again, in the single family zones, they would only be allowed by a religious organization per their right under state law. We did, however, though, add an administrative use permit would be required. And that's for us to help them and assess the situation that they're in, the context they're in. And then when we get to the performance standards, require that management plan, just so that they're thinking about the context in which they are located. So then going to the multifamily and the other zones, they are all permitted. The temporary, again, we had to make sure, the biggest change there was allowing them in the LI1 and LI2 zones, because as you can see in this table, the bottom use, we allowed hotels, motels in those two zones, and so we had to add that to the zone to be allowed, again with an administrative use permit. Let's see, did I get everything under that? Yes. Then here's where we're addressing the social service component of those residential uses and allowing them in, so you see the footnote there, So those social services are permitted as an accessory accessory use only in permanent supportive housing or transitional housing facilities, and those shelters that a religious organization might be hosting on their site. So making sure that those are permitted to be used and that they are serving the people that are there. It's not intended to host the social services and have other people come in to use them. So it's for the residents of the shelter or the housing. And then in the metro area, making sure that we had the provision for social services on a ground floor for those emergency uses. Next slide, please. So this is really the heart of the provisions. These are the performance standards in 1908-200. When we started this project, we had about 5 or 6 sections, and we were able to streamline and feel good that we've captured what we need and added what we need. So this section would apply to emergency housing, emergency indoor shelter, and emergency outdoor shelter. So the general provisions in B, which were many, some of the same ones that were in there before, but we only really addressed the outdoor emergency shelters in this section. So the general provisions will apply to all of those uses. And then C will apply to the outdoor emergency shelters, as they often are in unique contexts, circumstances. Next slide, please. So applicability, as I mentioned, it applies to all of those. We expanded it, and then it still doesn't apply to those emergency and disaster times when we may need a mass sheltering plan in an emergency or disaster. And then any placement of tiny homes that may go into manufactured or mobile home parks. So those are exempt from this section. Next slide. I'll cover the general provisions, and this is the summary. It's applicable to all of those uses. We are continuing to exempt the noticing requirements for domestic violence shelters. That's for safety and security purposes. It's an existing provision we have now. Making sure that we reference again that religious organizations' right to host people experiencing homelessness. And then there were some enhanced fire safety considerations. The key part too here is about the management responsibility plan. We've required that in the past, but it's really helpful, I think, for the community, for the city, and for the provider to spell out who's responsible, what those responsibilities are, and then we moved the code of conduct from where it was in this section under the management plan. And we also did remove the very prescriptive list. Number 1, it was, again, it's a prescriptive list, and we may be missing something, or something might be old. And so that code of conduct would be submitted with the management plan to the city to review, but it could be tailored to the specific sheltering situation or condition. And really those are rules to limit the adverse impacts from wherever they are. We'd like to see a transportation plan so we know how people are coming and going, ideally on a bus line, but that may not be the case. And then it talks about what standards can be modified when they apply for a permit. Next slide. And then under C is really completely applies to outdoor emergency shelters. So it talks about things such as duration. Previously, or it's existing. The existing code allows permitting of an outdoor emergency shelter for up to 90 days, and then you have to take it down and then move it someplace else. And this is really hard on resources. It's really hard on the residents of the shelter, and so we've expanded that to be for a year. So they can receive a permit for a year. They can ask for an extension. That's a good time to say, well, how's the shelter working? How is it running? Not only that, we have the ability to call the permit or repeal the permit. What's the word I'm looking for? We can tell them they have to take the shelter down at any point in their permitting. So, excuse me, that was a way to sort of, again, take a little bit of pressure off resources and the residents having to move every 60 days. We're suggesting a maximum site size after talking with the community development team and then the law enforcement folks, that for an outdoor emergency shelter, 40 units, tents, pallet shelters is probably as many as you want to have in one place, and that's just to keep order, being able to manage a facility. And then we also have a maximum of 100 people. There's setbacks, requirements for fencing, lighting, and then our ability to do inspections. And just some other small provisions. Next slide, please. So as you know, whenever you get in and start modifying codes, you're affecting other codes and other citations and other things. So there is a host here of other related amendments that we needed to take care of. In our Title 15, which is related to our processes, we needed to make changes that would move the permitting to an administrative use approval with an appeal to the hearing examiner. We took out the outdoor emergency shelters from the temporary use section. Thank you, dear. We wanted, since we've added that new definition about the extreme weather shelters, we wanted to add a section there to clarify what that is about. When we merged the definition for social services, there were a few other places in the code that required us to change that term. And as I mentioned earlier, replacing the parking requirements to use the permanent supportive housing rather than supportive housing use. Next slide. It's been a really long time since we've received feedback from the Department of Commerce on some of our code amendments, and so we are happy that they took the time to really thoroughly go through our code amendment proposal, and they had some suggestions, and they are suggestions. They weren't hard, fast, you need to change this. One of them was, and I appreciate this, we now use the term survivors of domestic violence instead of persons experiencing domestic violence, so we made those changes. We'll have to do another code scrub to see if it's in any other place in the code, but I think we got most of them. Then we had some language in there about if a resident of the shelter violated the code of conduct, that they would have to be permanently kicked out of the shelters. And that just seemed really harsh, especially in that kind of environment. Folks should have obviously depending on what it is, but folks should have the opportunity to come back if they've changed their behavior, and so that was a good call. We ended up just removing that section altogether and modifying that code of conduct section in the management plan. So I think we've got that covered here. So there were two suggestions that we evaluated and felt that we had it covered the way the proposal is drafted. And they wanted us to consider adding permanent supportive housing and transitional housing to our use matrix. However, we have visited that, before. We did have supportive housing in our use table, and it just wasn't, it wasn't necessary. We feel that the permanent supportive housing and transitional housing are really residential housing and don't need to be called out specifically. I think we're addressing it already. We've got provisions for the social services, so I think that we feel that it's adequately covered without putting it in the use matrix. And then they also suggested that we include a reference to the Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS. That's a social services network that the county manages, and they track homeless individuals, homeless folks that use this service. And it's usually tied to service funding or supportive services and housing. It would be very difficult for us to enforce something like this under a land use code. It really is tied to the social service funding and to that arena of social services. So we have suggested not to do those last two bullet items. Next slide. And then just procedurally, we've met our obligation. We issued a SEPA determination of non-significance, sent that to the State Department of Commerce for their 60-day review, and we have provided public notice of the hearing. Next slide. So with that, we can hand it back over to the Planning Commission, answer any questions.
Do we have any questions? Go ahead.
I have a question regarding on page 1 on the 1904 definitions. Under social services, it mentions that examples include services for behavioral health counseling. It mentions food banks, but then it follows that up with the next immediate sentence that says this definition does not include schools, hospitals, clinics, daycare, food banks, or residential uses. I just wanted to see if that was a typo or if there was some kind of intent behind that.
Well, let's double check that here.
It can't be right.
No.
That I do know. I remember talking about food banks with staff and whether there was a difference between the food banks and another use that we have in the use matrix. So let's see if we can find out
Oh, yeah,
real
we've
quick
got
if
that.
it should be in or out. Good catch. The existing definition of community services includes food banks and soup kitchens as an example. So I think it is the second food banks in the list of does not include that should be struck.
Yep.
Because our intent was not to substantially change the definitions, just to combine them. So you can see on the left side under community services, examples include food banks. And then I see under social services facilities, this definition does not include, and there's a list, and food banks is not in that.
We got excited about food banks.
Thank you. So if that works, I've crossed out food banks in our version here.
Any further questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask a quick question about the, let's see here, this is standards for outdoor emergency shelters under maximum size, so number 2. I see that the maximum number of residents is 100. That's existing language with the change of the definition, temporary encampment to outdoor emergency shelter. I see that, but then I just wanted to ask a little bit about the addition of the outdoor emergency shelters are limited to 40 units per site. And I just was wondering where the number 40 came from?
We had on our code amendment team for this project, we had community development, which they are responsible for our homeless response in the city as well. And they have some of the social workers that work with the police department. And so that was one of their, I mean, it's probably not a scientific threshold, but it is a threshold that they feel comfortable with in terms of allowing these. And in fact, we do have 40 of those pallet shelters behind the gospel mission, and that seems like the right number for management around that type of housing and sheltering.
Okay, so just to clarify, that was a recommendation by folks who are sort of experts in that field?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Becky, I'm wondering, during this whole process of putting these amendments together, did we get any input from the nonprofits, the providers who would be the most directly affected by these regulations?
We did not get any comments from them, but they were specifically targeted in terms of the notice. And so they all received notice that we were doing this, but we did not receive any.
So effectively, we indirectly invited them to participate, but they apparently opted not to, so silence can be considered assent.
And I would say we directly invited them to
Yes, we did.
participate.
Okay.
We've also been thinking through, there are a lot of proposals at any given time for new facilities, both in the immediate future and in the farther down the line. And we've been thinking about and kind of running through each of those proposals. What would it look like underneath, under the proposed code? The city council heard a briefing from community development on some upcoming projects, and those were some examples of one. I think there was a new pallet shelter site, and we basically ran it through these proposed code amendments on our side to make sure that it would work for at least those that are upcoming. And Chair Lavra, if I could correct myself
Yes.
from earlier. So that gave me enough time to look in our use matrix, and we do have a use for food bank. Food bank is a permitted use in the business zone, the LI zones, light industrial, and the heavy industrial zone, administrative use in the mixed urban and the neighborhood business zone. However, prohibited on the ground floor in Metro Everett on TOD or pedestrian streets. So if there is already a different use for food banks, that is probably why it was actually added to the does not include side. So I need to reverse myself from what I just said. Although I will feel a little bit better that that is a problem in existing code, I think. So that is why that was confused. So I will, luckily I have a pencil. I will cross out from the examples of food banks and leave it in does not include.
Commissioner Ballard.
I have a question on the use matrix. So it's more of a clarification that I'm understanding it correctly. So under social services, that's where supportive housing or permanent supportive housing would be allowed, referencing permitted and then 6, right? And then you would go down to 6. It says social service permitted as an accessory use only in permanent supportive housing facilities. So as an accessory, then does that then become discretionary?
By discretionary, you mean?
Well, as permitted, if you have a set of
Right.
rules and you follow the rules, you're
Right.
allowed to do it. If
Yeah.
it's an accessory,
Yes.
then going through that process, then does that move it into an area that would then go into more subjective discretionary approval, thereby being not making it permitted?
I would see it as permitted, because it's got the P in the use matrix. It's permitted as long as you're consistent with the footnote 6, which says that it cannot be a standalone facility, but would need to be as part of a permanent supportive or transitional housing facility. The accessory would not change the review process.
I only had a few, I think on this handout, I just had 2 or 3 really minor typos, which I'm just going to hand to Becky, I guess, because they're not worth discussing, but when you're crossing out and adding, sometimes things get left, so, yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? So at this point, we would open a public hearing. Nobody's here, though, so how do we handle that?
Well, we should open the public hearing and then close it, yeah.
So then we will need a motion to close the public hearing. You need it for both? Motion to open and close?
I'd like to make a motion that we open the public hearing.
Thank you.
Second.
I believe it's conceivable that your colleagues may not want to open the public hearing, and so that's why we have to go through
Okay,
that motion.
okay. I guess we need to vote then.
Commissioner Atkins,
Aye.
Commissioner Chatters,
Yes.
Commissioner Ballard,
Yes.
Commissioner Zelinski,
Yes.
Acting Chair Lavra.
Yes. Well, given that we do not have any members of the public in attendance, as far as we know, could we have a motion to close the public hearing?
I'll make a motion to close the public hearing.
Thank you.
Second.
Commissioner Atkins,
Aye.
Commissioner Chatters,
Yes.
Commissioner Ballard,
Yes.
Commissioner Zelinski,
Yes.
Acting Chair Lavra.
Yes. At this point, we could consider the motion to pass Resolution 2202, which is the last 2 pages of your packet. Commissioner Zelinski.
Seeing as how we've had extensive briefings on this topic and we've gone through some minor revisions during that period, and the intent of these amendments, these code amendments, is really to align our code with state law, which I think the staff has done a good job of being thorough about that. I see no reason not to move ahead and recommend for approval, and so I would move approval of resolution number 22002.
Thank you.
I'd like to second.
Ready for roll call?
We're ready for roll call, please.
Commissioner Atkins,
Aye.
Commissioner Chatters,
Yes.
Commissioner Ballard,
Yes.
Commissioner Zelinski,
Yes.
Acting Chair Lavra.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So we're ready to move on to removing limit on residence in a dwelling.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll take this one. And Pipa, if we could go to slide 19, just for a brief moment, and then you can go to slide 20. On slide 20 is a similar recap, or a similar plan for today's public hearing and briefing as we did for the first item. Start with a quick recap of the proposal, give some updates from the same communications we received from the Department of Commerce, hear from the public, take some questions, discussions, and deliberations from the commission, and then the intent is to move to a planning commission recommendation. Next slide. Similar to the last item, this is in response to a bill that was passed out of the Washington State Legislature. In this case, it's Senate Bill 5235. We've held briefings on this topic, same as the last one, in April, May, and June. Senate Bill 5235 sets the basic requirements that we are seeking to fulfill with this item, and that is that a city or town may not regulate or limit the number of unrelated persons that may occupy a household or a dwelling unit. Next slide. The highlighted words that you see in the definition of family here are the ones that could be seen as inconsistent with that new state law by creating a number of unrelated persons within a dwelling unit that represents, when it's combined with the definition for dwelling, represents a maximum number of people who can live in a dwelling unit. Next slide. We'll cover this in a moment, but since the last meeting, we've also realized that, and thanks to the Department of Commerce for this, but we realized that the 3 group housing definitions also restrict the number of residents in a dwelling. The reason that we had overlooked this is a very minor difference in wording. So in Senate Bill 5235, the full wording is that except for occupant limits on group living arrangements regulated under state law or on short-term rentals as defined in. So I think we had originally looked at that as saying that the group living situations regulated under state law were exempt from this bill, but actually on a careful reading, it's only those group living arrangements regulated under state law which have occupant limits under state law, and this was the advice that we received from Commerce. There are certain group housing situations that do have limits in state law. 16 individuals is the limit for state licensed. I'm not sure which one it is, but there are some of those. Others of them are not limited by state law, and so they would be in effect limited by the city code that you see here in highlighted. So we've incorporated that into the proposal, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Next slide. So our approach to becoming consistent with the requirements in state law is to delete the definition of family, and we did a look through all of the Title 19 of the Development Code to see where the term family was used and make sure that we weren't breaking any other definitions or any other use of the term, and we feel comfortable that we've gone through all of the uses of the term family, and they are all either self-explanatory or would be unaffected by deleting the definition of family. So the only real substantive impact would be to that definition of dwelling that is limiting the number of people in a dwelling unit. You can see the proposed changes to the definition of dwelling, and if you remember from a couple of months back, there were 2 definitions in code, and we had proposed deleting one of the 2 definitions, consolidating into one, and then instead of stating that a dwelling is designed to be occupied by one family, we would say it's designed to be occupied by one or more persons. Note the word shared in there is a new word in the definition of dwelling, and so it puts a little bit of emphasis on the entire dwelling unit being available to all of the occupants of that dwelling unit, and so that can create some of the distinction where it might not be clear when it is one dwelling unit versus a duplex or an accessory dwelling unit. And so if you are starting to partition a dwelling unit into separate areas not accessible to everyone, locked doors, different kitchens, different bathrooms, we would treat that separately. But as long as everybody has the run of the dwelling, then it is considered a dwelling. We also made a little change to we no longer have reference to the Everett Housing Code, and instead we'll point to Title 16 Building and Construction. And there are some useful provisions within the building and construction codes to make sure that life safety issues are properly handled if there are more people living in a dwelling unit. Next slide. And these definitions, the full text of them, these are, some of these are summaries, but the full text is in Exhibit A to the staff memo. We are also proposing to delete the bed and breakfast house and rooming house definitions. The bed and breakfast house, what was our, okay, so so Senate Bill 5235 exempted short-term rentals from the provisions of the bill. Because of that, we added a portion thereof to the definition of a short-term rental. So our current definition for short-term rental is only when you're renting the entire dwelling unit, not if you are renting one room within it. Since the bill referenced short-term rentals, and there is a state definition of short-term rentals that includes, and I think many of the definitions of short-term rentals out there in other jurisdictions include partial unit rentals. We made that amendment to our definition of short-term rentals. Since short-term rentals were added to the use matrix, I think we talked about this a couple meetings ago as well, bed and breakfast house as a distinct use has ceased to be useful because pretty much everything that would be a bed and breakfast house could also be called a short-term rental. Short-term rentals are allowed just about everywhere in the city, so there would be no real reason for anyone to propose a bed and breakfast house when they could achieve the same objectives as a short-term rental. Rooming house only, that's an easier story. Rooming house only exists in opposition to a dwelling unit. It is what a dwelling unit is under current code when you have too many people living in it. And so if you're removing that limit on the number of people living in a dwelling unit, because if you see the definition of rooming houses, a structure used for purposes of providing lodging or lodging and meals for persons other than those under the family definition. And that is the roundabout connection to the upper limit on the number of people within a dwelling unit. Of course, we have to delete wherever bed and breakfast shows up, such as in hotel and motel. Next slide. You can see these changes in the use matrix, just deleting bed and breakfast house and rooming house, and the use matrix is in Exhibit B. Next slide. There are also some development standards associated with those uses, and so all of the requirements associated with the bed and breakfast house in 1908-140 would be struck. And then in 1908-130, there is a limit to the rental of rooms is limited to 2 roomers, and that's also connected to this upper limit on the number of people who can live in a dwelling. And so that is, we're proposed to remove that. Next slide. And for short-term rentals, the only change here, so the definition is partially repeated in this code section on development standards. I don't think that's the best way to go, but we didn't want to make huge changes. So we're making the same change that we did to the definition to this section 19.08.150. And the parking requirements, like to keep those all together in the parking chapter. And so you see parking here, the only changes are to move it out of 19.08.150 into chapter 34, which is the parking chapter. And then because we are adding to the definition of short-term rentals, a partial rental, a room rental, then we need to have a parking standard for that, which we borrowed from hotel, motel, and bed and breakfast house, which is 1 off-street parking space per guest room for rental of rooms within a dwelling unit. I think at the last meeting, we talked about the parking standard for short-term rentals in general, which is 3 off-street spaces if you have on-street parking and 4 off-street spaces if you have off-street parking, and how that's kind of a blunt instrument and ignores whether it's a large rental, a small rental. It would potentially prohibit short-term rentals within an apartment building or a condo building, for instance, because you're not often going to have the ability to secure 4 off-street spaces to rent a 1-bedroom within an apartment or a condo. So I think those are very compelling arguments. In discussing it amongst staff since the last meeting, we felt that the scope creep was a little bit was a little bit dangerous here, and that the amount of study and research that would be necessary to find out what the appropriate parking standard would be for short-term rentals would be at least somewhat substantial. And so we have elected to remain in the staff recommendation with not changing the existing parking requirement for short-term rentals, although we will look to pick that up in the next ordinance that is within striking distance of parking for short-term rentals. We realize that we have already gone a couple of layers outside of the immediate goal of consistency with that state law. But we thought that that made sense as a place to stop it. Now, that's something that the Planning Commission and the Council can certainly take a different position on, but that's the staff recommendation at this time. So those are the only other changes to short-term rentals. Next slide. And back to the group housing. So this was another comment from Commerce, was to review the regulations related to group housing for consistency with that bill, and to be conscious of the difference between licensed by state law and has occupant limits regulated by state law. Next slide. And so here is our proposed response to that Commerce comment that seemed to raise a good point. Right now, group housing is split into 3 categories. The first 2 are the same except for the number of residents. And so we propose combining group housing category 1 and category 2 into one, and calling it group housing residential care facility, which is what the 2 category 1 and category 2 are. And we would remove the upper limit of individuals in the residential care facility. And those residential care facilities are, I think, primarily adult family homes and assisted living facilities. I believe there are some others as well. And then group housing extended care facility, there would be no change to that because it was not inconsistent. Next slide. And then you can see here what the impact would be on the use matrix, and this is Exhibit B in your packet. And here in the combined definition for group housing residential care facility, we would maintain the same permissions and the same reference notes, except that these would be permitted in the RS, R1, R2, and R2A zones, but a reference note 12 would hold that that would be a conditional use permit if there are more than 6 individuals. Next slide. Same procedural steps as the last proposal. Issued a determination of non-significance under the State Environmental Policy Act on June 23rd. We did the state agency review facilitated by the Department of Commerce, and we have published notice of today's public hearing. And last slide. With that, turning to the commission for any questions you might have before we open the public hearing and move to discussion and deliberations.
Does anyone have a question or comment?
Just a quick question. So I'm looking at the Exhibit B, group housing residential care facility, and so I just want to clarify, did you say that the conditional use permit required for group housing and residential care facilities serving more than 6 individuals, that number 6, did you say that was part of state law that defined that number as 6?
No, the number 6 was the distinction. I feel like this got really loud all of a sudden. The number 6 6 individuals was the distinction between category 1 and category 2.
Okay, okay,
And so, in existing code, if you have over 6 individuals, then the group housing residential care facility would be prohibited altogether in the RS, R1, R2, and R2A zones. The proposal would be for 6 and above, to now permit it, but to have a conditional use permit process, recognizing that there might be some potential impacts that might need to be mitigated through conditions.
okay, thank you. And then another question, just because I like to know where these definitive numbers, where they originated from, is on EMC 19.08150, Section D, number of guests. The total number of guests occupying a dwelling unit may not exceed 8. And so I'm just wondering where that number 8 originated from, if we know that?
Yeah, that was, that's a really old one, I think. That's been around for a long time. I don't know where it came from. I think a lot of these codes that have been around for a long time came from model codes that were developed nationally. Maybe one jurisdiction, even in another state, started it, and it seemed to work, and so it spread nationally. But that's my best guess, and other than that, I'm not sure.
Okay, and my purpose for bringing them up is that I would think that when we have a hard number like that, that doesn't really take into consideration any of the characteristics of the actual thing, that is a potential point of problems. And so this is probably scope creep. So I don't know that this is the appropriate time to address something like that. What are your thoughts on that?
So the limit of 8, is that not what we're deleting today?
Well,
Or-
it does not, not according to this. It says number of guests.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the unrelated residents in a dwelling.
Correct.
Right. okay.
Yes.
The number of guests in a short-term rentals, that
Correct.
is more recent, but I still don't know exactly where that came from.
Okay.
Yes, changing that would represent scope creep.
Right.
I think that's something that you could add into your recommendation for the city council, and that's something that we could try to do the work to research it.
Yeah, I don't know how other commissioners feel about that, but I would like to recommend that we determine the origin of that number and consider removing that constraint.
Sometimes, I mean, at the end of the day, you can also point to the legislative body, and that might have been a negotiated compromise between city council members some years ago. That might be, rather than any scientific method. 7 is a lot of people, 8 is a lot, 9 is too many.
Commissioner Atkins.
I had a kind of a follow-up. How difficult would it be for staff to figure out how many dwelling units we have in the city that have more than 4 bedrooms?
Actually, we have that information. The Census American Community Survey has information on structure size, and I think there is a tally for 4 or more. I remember this from the park impact fee, and some of you that were here for that last winter may remember there was a calculation done, and citywide, fun fact, we have 1.01 people per bedroom, I think. So throughout the entire city, we have almost exactly 1 person per bedroom. So there is that information to know roughly how many 4-bedroom pluses there are.
They're actually in the housing needs assessment of the housing action plan. That's a little bit older information at this point, but there is an inventory of the housing stock, and it does, just seeing if I could pull it up real quick. But yeah, so it's available.
Any further questions or comments? Well, I'm a little confused about some of the parking regulations. So am I correct that if it's not crossed out or underlined, it's existing? It's?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it should be.
It should be. Well, so the third line down, it has boarding or rooming house crossed out, but it leaves dormitories and 1 per 3 bedrooms. Is that intended?
Yes, the parking standard was the same for those uses listed, and we're deleting the boarding house, but dormitories will remain as a use that will have a parking standard associated with it.
Okay.
So the intent was to not touch that piece
Okay,
of it.
because we haven't talked about dormitories at all. and
No,
that's-
yes, exactly. So yeah, that's out of scope.
Okay, okay. Well, some of the wording kind of, I have questions about, but if they're existing and you're not proposing to change.
If it's in the scope, I mean, we are trying to streamline, improve, clarify, and all of that. And if it's minor things, that can be something that you can hand us offline, and we'll work it into the city council packet too, if it's kind of non-substantive tone type of thing.
So the daycare one, just below that, the line daycare, family home, or adult family home, 2 per dwelling unit. So in this case, dwelling unit means the whole house? Not
Yes.
specific rooms? Okay, so that makes sense.
Yes, because those are uses that occur within a dwelling.
Okay, okay. And then. No, I think that answers my questions, except the last one. Did you say you are not changing the short-term rentals, even though it's shown here as an addition?
We are adding, because we are expanding the definition of short-term rentals to include partial home rentals, we are adding a parking for those partial home rentals.
Okay,
We were not proposing to change for what is existing parking regulations for whole home rentals.
okay, that answers my questions. Anybody else have a question, comment?
I have a question, but I remember you promised us a parking discussion party, so I'm looking forward to that.
And we will deliver.
Yeah,
Chair Lavra, I do have an answer for Commissioner Atkins.
oh, good.
4,862, would that be bedrooms? Units with 4 bedrooms in the city. 11% of the city's dwellings have 4 bedrooms. Another 3% have 5 or more.
Thanks for getting that info.
Wow. If we're completed with our discussion, I would need a motion to open a public hearing.
I motion to open a public hearing on, or are we doing it for the resolution?
I think we need to have a hearing.
We do, yeah, they're combined. The public hearing is on the proposal, which includes the resolution.
Okay. Then I just motion to open the public hearing.
Okay, thank you,
Second.
thank you.
Commissioner Atkins,
Aye.
Commissioner Chatters,
Yes.
Commissioner Ballard,
Yes.
Commissioner Zelinski,
Yes?
Acting Chair Lavra.
Yes, thank you. Now, we do have a member of the public present, so would you like to speak to this issue?
No, I'm just here in support.
Okay,
Not of the issue, I'm not sure what the issue is.
okay.
Part of the planning.
Well, welcome, and we haven't had much attendance today. And do we have anybody online for this part of it? Okay, so at this point, I would entertain a motion to close the hearing.
I'd like to make a motion to close the public hearing.
I'll second that motion.
Thank you.
Commissioner Atkins,
Aye.
Commissioner Chatters,
Yes.
Commissioner Ballard,
Yes.
Commissioner Zelinski,
Yes?
Acting Chair Lavra.
Yes.
Thank you.
I would like to make a motion to pass, what's the number? Resolution number 22-003.
I would second that motion.
Yes, please.
Commissioner Atkins,
Aye.
Commissioner Chatters,
Yes.
Commissioner Ballard,
Yes.
Commissioner Zelinski,
Yes?
Acting Chair Lavra.
Yes.
Thank you.
So at this point, I guess we're ready to adjourn unless you have more comments or.
No, I think that's all we have. I'm gonna maybe do some talking with staff and maybe the chair who's gonna be back for the next meeting about our voting. It seems a little bit, seems to take a long time to do the roll call votes for some of these interim steps. And I wonder if we might be able to move to just a voice vote for opening public hearing, closing public hearing, and then do the roll call vote for like the final vote on the ordinance. And I think typically when I've seen that, you do the voice vote, and if it's not clear, then you shift to a roll call vote. But that might just kind of smooth our path. If there's any thoughts about that, happy to hear it.
Would it be possible to just have the chair start doing with a hearing no objection?
I think so, yeah. So we'll check with our attorneys, and I don't see why that would be a problem. And make sure that it comports with the bylaws and see if the chair is okay with that. But yeah, that would be even more streamlined, and we're all about efficiency.
I'm a little rusty on procedure, I guess, but.
Is it possible to see, like,